Hey, so does anyone remember FTL Faster Than Light? Released in 2012 by Subset Games, FTL Faster Than Light is a strategy roguelike indie game where you take control of a Federation spaceship as it voyages across the galaxy to stop a rebellious uprising. Along the way you encounter randomized events, strange alien races, and giant alien spiders. Ah, fuck. Hey, so does anyone remember FTL Faster Than Light? Let's be honest, most of you watching don't need an introduction to this game. For the rest of you, well, I can tell you that this neat little laser 'em up created by Justin Marr and Matthew Davis is a masterpiece of game design. It's elegant, it's addictive, and it features the most bangin' video game soundtrack this side of Rigel 7. But much as I could go on about FTL's exquisitely crafted game mechanics, that's not what this video is about. This video is about those snippets of text you mostly ignore because all you really care about is how much scrap you got from killing those poor Zoltans. FTL presents an intriguing perspective on modelling morality in video games, one that I've seen discussed here and there but never really examined for a wider audience. And if there's one thing you can count on me to do, it's analysing something very few people care about with far more depth than anyone ever asked for, and eventually amassing a quite staggering amount of views. To that end, today I will be throwing FTL at the wall of philosophical ethics and hoping whatever sticks is comprehensible enough to teach us something. In other words, can FTL tell us what is morally right? Which theories of right and wrong does it subscribe to, and how does its gameplay encode them? With the help of Star Trek, people being run over in creative ways, and BuzzFeed quizzes? I promise it all makes sense once we get there. Let's take a closer look at FTL Faster Than Light. Trolley problems. In space! Shanghai, 2011. In apartments hidden somewhere within the urban sprawl, two men make a decision that will go on to change the landscape of video games forever. Those men are Justin Marr and Matthew Davis. Marr is primarily an artist, Davis is a programmer, and both work for 2K Games. The decision is to stop working for 2K Games. Marr in particular had become disillusioned with game development, at least at major studios. A trip to the Game Developers Conference in San Francisco had given him a glimpse of the alternative, and shown him that making games as an independent developer was a viable option. Davis had left 2K a few months earlier, and Marr, convinced of his new opportunity, did the same. The two came up with a plan. Spend 1 year developing a game together, and if after that period they had no promising path forward, give up. I have to say that's a level of restraint with time-sinking personal projects I can only ever dream of. But what game did they even want to make? Well, Marr and Davis had played a load of board games together, often with a top-down management kind of feel. Things like the Battlestar Galactica board game, where players move around a spaceship and manage its resources as it jumps through hyperspace. They were surprised at the lack of video games about spaceship management. Most were more concerned with combat, which is fun, don't get me wrong, but it's been around so long it's probably about time someone added a bit of variety. Throw in healthy dollops of Star Trek and Firefly, and you have yourself the vision that would become FTL Faster Than Light. I think Matthew Davis himself puts it best.
And we watch the captain, and he's the center of everything, and it's not the pilot, and so we wanted to give you that Captain Kirk feeling, the controlling your crew and telling where to aim and what to do.
They also stressed that they didn't start with any kind of pitch, just a nebulous, overarching feeling of being a star captain rushing around trying to fix an ever-growing list of space problems. Right from the beginning, though, they knew they wanted the game to be hard. Permadeath, the inability to revert to an earlier save state, was a feature the whole way through, which is especially punishing when half your fate is determined by a random number generator. The other half is forgetting to upgrade the engines, which is your own stupid fault, but still. Looking at early versions of FTL, you can certainly see the vision coming together, but it's a long way off what we know and love. Not least because the crew members are all circles with cat faces.
Those are Matt's cats.
Which you'll see as we go through the screenshots, they stay a lot longer than
yeah,
they should have.
they stay pretty long.
Among all the game mechanics added and subtracted throughout development, there is one that it's important for us to make a brief note of. Marr and Davis initially planned to include an abstract representation of crew morale. This makes sense, as the captain's role in sci-fi is often not just one of ship management, but also people management. The Battlestar Galactica board game they took inspiration from even includes crew morale as a resource which can be depleted. But for FTL, the idea was ultimately scrapped. So too were the cat faces, which is clearly a catastrophic error someone with mod-making ability needs to rectify. But with or without crew morale and cat faces, Marr and Davis were going to make a game, and make a game they did. Sticking true to their original vision throughout, they tweaked and fine-tuned as needed until after a year or so, they had a functional game. And after a successful showcase at the Independent Games Festival, they decided their experiment had yielded results worth pursuing further. Enter Kickstarter. You know Kickstarter, right? The crowdfunding site that brought us the Ouya. Well, FTL was one of Kickstarter's first big success stories, earning a whopping 20 times Subset's asking price. Suddenly, Marr and Davis had more money than they knew what to do with, because a metric buttload of people were in fact masochistic enough to want to play this terrible, awful game about dying in space. Hey, just in Marr's words, not mine.
And we're like, no way people would be masochistic enough to want to play this terrible, awful game about dying in space.
Okay, the metric buttload part was mine. The two put this windfall to work by contracting specialists to flesh out parts of the game they hadn't focused on. After all, their specialisms lay in art, programming, and game mechanics. Those can get you far in life, as the IGF demo showed, but to make a truly iconic game, you need a few other things. They hired Ben Prunty to create the music, and wait, is that Cubase? I use Cubase. Oh man, now I can't make the excuse that it's my equipment that's holding me back. They also hired game writer Tom Gibert to expand the text content, as well as Chris Avallone for a few extra events in the free Advanced Edition expansion. Given that Gibert was responsible for the majority of the writing, which is what this video is all about, it seems a good idea to understand what makes this guy tick. Gibert initially studied computer science, but cut the degree short because he detested the maths.
Never before have I been so offended by something I 100% agree with.
He switched to studying English and philosophy instead, graduating best in class at Southampton. Hey, that's almost where I'm from. Wow, we did something for the world other than launch a big doomed boat. Nice. His bachelor's in hand, Gibert found his way into the game writing business. He would go on to write for Driver San Francisco, The Talos Principle, and Subnautica, among many others. Much of Gibert's work has a heavy philosophical flavour. The Talos Principle, for instance, sees the player take on the role of an artificial intelligence, its story confronting them with heady questions about the nature of consciousness. The Swapper, a game where the player transports their character's mind between multiple clones, is similarly obsessed with the philosophy of identity. Gibert's personal projects are also strongly influenced by his academic background, such as Irrational, a game he developed himself that he describes as a dark, philosophical tale of one man's struggle to come to terms with his powers of deduction. In between his writing exploits, he even went and did a master's in philosophy at King's College London because the BA alone wasn't enough for him. In short, this guy likes philosophy and he likes putting philosophy in his games. But FTL was a bit of a special case. By the time Marr and Davis had set up their Kickstarter, the game was fairly close to completion. They sought funding mainly for extra polish and support as they pushed through the final few obstacles. Obviously that scope changed a bit after the Kickstarter's enormous success, but as Gibert has said, from a writing standpoint he joined late in the process. Marr and Davis had already designed the world and game narrative, at least at a high level. Many of their decisions were motivated purely by game mechanics. They needed an alien race that generated power, they chose a green glowy man. They needed a race that had a combat advantage, they chose a giant bug with serrated arms. It was Gibert's job to flesh these concepts out, creating the lore behind the mechanics. Rockmen, for instance, started out as merely a sturdy, fire-resistant sprite. Then Gibert got his hands on them and built an honour-based, authoritarian theocracy around them, one that makes perfect sense given the race's physical attributes. FTL delivers its lore through minimal text hints, drip-feeding the player with a little more information each playthrough. In a way, the mystery and brevity help connect us with the setting. We're looking through a small window into a vast, unknowable universe, much like our own real-life experience. In fact, Marr and Davis were explicit in wanting an ambiguous game world. Gibert purportedly pushed for more involved narrative elements, but the devs wanted to leave a lot unsaid to make room for the player's own story. They had justification for this approach. Even 6 months into development, Justin Marr's brother Brian was empathising with the minimalist, unnamed sprites he was brutally murdering. He did, however, insist that they should be sprites and not circles as they had been up to that point. So maybe there is a middle ground.
He was like, you gotta get rid of the circles, you gotta get rid of the circles. And we're like, what's wrong with the circles? I like the circles.
Despite this restriction, FTL's universe is relatively deep and, in places, a tiny bit philosophical. Take the NG. Are these humanoid nanomachine swarms organic? Robotic? Are they even a single consciousness? The game either asks these questions itself or invites the player to ask them through its fleeting descriptions. Then of course we have that most existentially nightmarish of medical devices, the clone bay. Does a reconstructed crew member remain the same person? Does their consciousness persist? If so, does that mean consciousness isn't a part of the physical self? Because I'm pretty sure I saw that physical self burn to a crisp on the enemy ship. For more clone bay quandaries to keep you up at night, why not watch Ratboy Pleb's animated FTL serial on the Kestrel?
Yeah, sometimes if I can't sleep, I'll just off myself with whatever's on hand, and it just spits out a new me in the morning.
Actually, why not just watch On the Kestrel full stop? I mean, seriously, this thing is criminally underviewed, and any view my video might get in excess of that is just a reason to weep, really. While it's not clear how much of each came from Joubert and how much came from the two main devs, these two problems are eerily similar to Joubert's central questions in the Talos Principle and the Swapper. I'm willing to bet he played some part in at least bringing these identity dilemmas to the fore. The origin of FTL's ethical dilemmas, however, questions of right and wrong and which is which and how one should be a good and caring person, well, I think that started with the two original devs, as we'll see later, but I do sometimes have my doubts.
Like with FTL, I do not know what it's like to get attached to your crew members. That's impossible.
We've never understood it.
Psychopaths or not, Marr and Davis were eventually successful in their gamble. FTL released in September 2012, complete with all the music and writing Kickstarters combined. It received unanimously rave reviews, a whole bunch of awards, and a reputation for streamlined fiendishness that cemented its place among the video game greats. Even today it maintains a strong community full of people making mods, fanworks, and this one weird video essay about FTL and philosophy. Speaking of which, we've had a fair bit of the FTL now, but not much of the philosophy. I think it's about time we shelve this discussion and fix that. I am not a philosopher, nor have I ever studied philosophy in any formal setting. The content delivered in this video reflects my understanding of the topics I researched and is thus liable to unintentional misrepresentation. Corrections will be pinned in the comments if brought to my attention. My main sources are in the description, and if this video intrigues you, I suggest you engage with them, because let's face it, I am but one man creating videos to make internet strangers go, oh, that was interesting, and nothing I say should ever be taken as a substitute for a proper education. Right, now that that's out the way, let's talk about memes. Well, one specific meme. The trolley problem. Many of you will know the original formulation by heart. A trolley, or tram for those of us on this side of the pond, is careering down the track. It's about to kill 5 people, but you have the power to pull a lever and divert it to a separate track where it will kill only 1 person. Should you take the choice resulting in fewer deaths? Or should you do nothing and walk away with your hands clean? Would your hands even be clean? Obviously, the internet got a hold of this and did its thing, and now we have thousands of increasingly niche variations of the original problem killing people in ever more creative ways. I'm particularly partial to the Monty Hall trolley problem myself, but unfortunately we're going to stick to the original here. Maybe though you think that even that is an irrelevant thought experiment that could never actually play out in reality. Okay, well in answer to that, I have another thought experiment. Let's suppose, hypothetically, that there's some kind of virus that recently appeared and is causing chaos all over the world. Countries are on lockdown, people are fighting over basic resources, and celebrities are singing a dubious rendition of Imagine. You know, insane apocalypse type stuff. Let's also suppose that you are part of a team developing a vaccine for the virus. You need to make sure it actually works. But how? One obvious method would be to expose vaccinated volunteers to the virus itself. This is a quick and highly controllable approach that may well get them all killed if your vaccine doesn't actually work. Alternatively, you can administer a vaccine, then let your volunteers loose upon the world to potentially contract the disease naturally without your intervention. The problem with the second method? It's a hell of a lot slower. In the time it takes the virus to infect your volunteers to a statistically significant degree, millions more across the world might contract the disease. Millions who, had you chosen the quicker option, could have been protected months ago. Much like the trolley problem, then, you can put a few people at risk directly or many people at risk indirectly. Which path are you ethically obliged to follow? The direct exposure method is called a challenge trial. Human challenge trials have been used on some occasions, but many people find them deplorable. Even from my very brief overview, you may have strong opinions one way or the other. Which leads me to a general point about the ethical dilemmas I'm covering in this video. I cannot tell you what the right answer is. They're called dilemmas for a reason, and they wouldn't have the staying power that they do if they had obvious solutions. Thousands of years of thought under our belts, and more often than not we get stuck on defining what right answer even means. I mean, it's not like you can say,
now, I like
the ontological pluralism, negative total utilitarianism.
But which is better? There's only one way to find out.
Because that's how wars start. But we can get somewhere. We can look at ethical frameworks we could adopt and how we should act according to each of them. Broadly speaking, philosophical ethics can be divided into three main areas. Applied ethics, where we apply an ethical code to a given situation. Normative ethics, where we choose the factors we value in making those decisions to formulate such a code. And meta-ethics, where we talk about the nature of moral reasoning itself. Annoyingly, the boundaries tend to get a bit blurred. I think most of what I'll be talking about counts as normative ethics, with a bit of applied thrown in, so let's begin there. What is normative ethics? Suppose you're an accomplished swimmer who encounters a drowning child. You can easily save them with no risk to yourself. I'm hoping most of you would save them without hesitation, but you do have the choice not to. Why do we view saving the child as the ethical thing to do? Maybe you think human life has an intrinsic value. Maybe you think it will lead to more happiness in the world. Maybe you just have a particular personal belief that you should always save drowning children. Maybe you think anything with hair has intrinsic value. Most reasonable ethical frameworks would align in this case, even if for different reasons. But by teasing out those reasons, we can better define right and wrong to improve our understanding of more complex situations. The factors we care about when making such a decision are called normative factors. Some may be logically derived from other factors, while others may be the final truth, the accepted starting assumption of your framework. The intrinsic factors are in that way kind of like mathematical axioms. Side note, one of my sources on normative ethics went into a bit more detail on the maths-like logic and eventually ended up comparing something to Gödel's incompleteness theorem. Elsewhere, it also discussed how we intuit normative factors using the System 1, System 2 cognition model championed by Daniel Kahneman, which makes it only the second time I've ever seen Gödel and Kahneman referenced in the same place after one of my videos. Maybe I was onto something. Normative ethics is all about determining the intrinsic factors, figuring out the most basic reasons why an action or rule has ethical force. Whatever conclusion you come to is then an example of a normative theory. There are obviously a great many of these, but they largely fit into a few main camps. To help you understand some of them, I've created an innovative new tool that's going to take the world of philosophical ethics by storm. Which normative ethical thinker are you? The BuzzFeed quiz. Question 1. How would you solve the trolley problem? A. Pull the lever. B. Don't pull the lever. C. Spend ages trying to make a noble decision and run out of time. D. Grab some popcorn and enjoy the show. Question 2. You're standing on a bridge above a track where a trolley is about to kill 5 people. Next to you stands a large man. If you could push him off the bridge, you could stop the trolley, but he would die. What do you do? A. Push the man. B. Don't push the man because that would be actively killing someone. C. Don't push the man because you know you can't look him in the eyes and do it. Or D. Take the man's wallet, then push him. Question 3. A madman with an axe knocks on your door and asks you where he can find your friend. What do you do? A. Lie about your friend's location and tip off the police. B. Tell the truth. C. Refuse to answer, even if you risk him turning on you. D. Tell the truth. For a price. Question 4. You're flying a bomber plane in a just war. You could bomb the munitions factory or bomb the local school to undermine morale. Which of these are acceptable? A. Both if it ends the war quicker. B. Neither, there may be people in either. C. Only the munitions factory because that's the only honourable option. Or D. Both, plus the rest of the city for a high score. Question 5. What are your plans for the weekend? A. Studying to become a scientist and change the world. B. Going to church. C. Learning new skills to become a better person. Or D. Drinking, partying and carnal debauchery. Question 6. Which of these hairstyles do you relate to most? Right, let's see what you got, shall we? If you answered mostly A, you are John Stuart Mill, and your normative ethical theory is utilitarianism. Utilitarianists choose the option which maximises utility, a function of well-being and happiness, across an entire population. In utilitarianism, the ends justify the means. So you are not only permitted to divert the trolley, you have to. More people will be alive and happy that way. Of course, in more complex scenarios, things still get messy when you have differing levels of happiness to weight across an entire population. But it's a starting point. Utilitarianism is a subset of a larger family of theories called consequentialism, where the outcome of an action decides its worthiness. In contrast, if you chose mostly B, you are Immanuel Kant and you subscribe to deontology. Deontologists care less about the outcome and more about the action itself. They have one or more personal rules that they should never violate. Don't murder, don't lie, etc. Often these are religious in nature, but they don't have to be. For a deontologist, the ends never justify the means. Letting 5 people die is acceptable because the alternative is to directly murder someone, a violation of a rule not to murder. This holds even if your actions have negative consequences. So long as the actions themselves were pure, even quite absurd choices are acceptable because you only have the responsibility for your own moral agency and not the actions of others. If you answered mostly C, you believe in the virtue ethics of Socrates, Plato and Aristotle. There are, however, enormous asterisks on every answer here because virtue ethics doesn't lend itself very well to dilemmas like this. It doesn't really prescribe rules to follow or actions to take. Instead, it's concerned with the purity of the motivations of whoever's taking the action. Providing you're always striving to embody some virtue, courage, understanding, loyalty, etc., virtue ethics says you're a-okay. Even if you fail, that's fine, because the ability to learn from your mistakes is virtuous in itself. I personally find virtue ethics the hardest to get my head around, but I'll chalk that up to a failure on my part, if only so I can embody the virtue of modesty. And finally, D. Yes, this is a real ethical system. It's called ethical egoism. Do whatever ends up giving you, personally, the most pleasure. It's a kind of hedonism, which is another kind of consequentialism. And you all thought these were joke answers that no actual philosopher would ever condone. Hold on, just realised I need to add something to my comments blacklist. The entire point of that exercise, alongside being #fun, was to demonstrate patterns in a few ethical worldviews and prime your understanding of how these worldviews may react to ethical dilemmas. If you decide to wholeheartedly subscribe to one normative theory, then great, maybe I have solved the trolley problem for you. Unfortunately, most of us won't, so even with an approach that's more rigorous than, oh, it just feels like the right thing to do, things are still pretty murky. And as I said, these are just a few normative theories to give you a working overview. Each splinters into many sub-theories with their own disagreements and complications. And we're going to look at them all right now. Psst, Oliver. Alright, yes, sorry. Totally forgot what this video was about. Silly me. Through the afterglow of your FTL drive, you spot a ship hanging close to the beacon. You recognise the ship as a well-known slave trader. He hails you and offers you labourers for cheap. You could take him up on his offer. You could attack the ship, or you could do nothing. You choose attack. In the face of your tactical superiority, the slaver has no option but to surrender, even offering up a free slave as tribute. You can either graciously accept and welcome brand spanking new subjugated personnel on board, or blow both slaves and slave trader to Kingdom Come and harvest their remains. This is the so-called Friendly Slaver event, and if you're a fan of FTL, you've seen it a million times. You may have explored every variation, even the hidden ones you get when you have a teleporter or kill the enemy crew without destroying the ship. Spoilers for those two, I guess. Back in 2013, historian Christopher Sawula wrote a blog post dissecting this event, catching the eye of game journalist Bill Coberly writing for The Ontological Geek, which itself drew the attention of our old friend Tom Joubert. Joubert subsequently gave a talk on slavery in FTL at a game writing conference, but the video's no longer available. Yeah, that was rather a consternating discovery in my research. Point is, I'm about to paraphrase all three to the point of probable mutilation, so please go read the original posts as well. Based on the event as it appears in-game, how does FTL view slavery? On the one hand, the text describes slave traders as scum, puts labourers in quotes, and after the destruction of the ship, says the slave trade is evil. So on an explicit textual level, the game correctly states that slavery is abhorrent. But the subtext on the other hand is muddled. Viewed through the right lens, the choices become a little trolley problem-ish. If you accept the slaver's offer or tribute, you free one slave. If free is the right word, but we'll come to that later. But the slaver is also free to blast off into the galaxy and continue making alien lives a living hell. If you don't take the offer and destroy the ship, you've indirectly saved many slaves-to-be, but you've also just killed a load of people, including many who are innocent. Is one slave's freedom more important than the freedom of all the slaver's future victims? As we discussed, the utilitarian argument is no. Ending the slave trade as a whole is more ethical. Just as for the trolley problem though, a deontologist with a duty to uphold life might disagree. Killing even a few slaves constitutes an ethically unacceptable action. But in that case, obligation to directly saving one slave means you're doing business with the slavers, which is its own moral quagmire. Of course, you could ignore the ship entirely, but then you're still enabling the slave traders by not confronting them for their evil deeds. And let's think about the slave you saved for a moment. You now have direct control over everything they do. Is that really better? Let's face it, you're almost certainly going to die a horrible death because you didn't buy a defense drone, you knucklehead, and they're going with you. Unless you beat the entire game, you've just doomed them anyway. Really, if you were a truly virtuous person, you would dismiss them the moment they stepped on board. Wherever you look in this event, you find a moral calculus. Any action, even inaction, carries ethical baggage. As Bill Coberly writes, it would have been easy to write this encounter less ambiguously. Maybe the freed slave willingly joins your crew, or after the enemy ship takes enough damage, the slaves revolt instead of letting you destroy them all. But that's not the decision Mart, Davis and Joubert made. They consciously wrote encounters like this to challenge the player with unbiased moral decisions. According to Joubert, Davis says that they set out specifically to not have a message. They wanted to present a series of systems and choices and encourage the player to come to their own conclusion without judgment. Further, not taking a stance conveys the idea that these dilemmas are indeed complex. The FTL universe is a grim place full of death, war and clone bays, and decisions made there are rarely black and white. As another example, consider the event where you stumble upon a rebel ship providing supplies to local civilians. You can attack the rebels, steal the civilian supplies, or do nothing. Other than ignoring the event, every path leads you somewhere unpleasant. If you defeat the ship and leave the civilians alone, you may be bombarded with accusatory messages from the locals who say they're going to die without the rebels' help. If you steal the supplies, you find out they're rudimentary building materials, or vaccinations for a local plague, or bombs set by rebel sympathizers which you start to feel you might deserve.
Are we the baddies?
One variation even explicitly states that for you, a few more dead rebels matter more than the lives of 1,000 colonists. That's one messed up trolley problem. This event pretty closely mirrors my bomber plane example from earlier, with the added complication that the school and munitions factory will be caught in each other's crossfire. In philosophical terms, it's an instance of the doctrine of double effect. Sometimes an accidental harmful side effect is viewed as acceptable on the path to a good result, whereas intentionally doing the same harm for the same result may not be. Stealing the civilian supplies is intentional harm for a supposedly good reason, whereas leaving the civilians alone after destroying the rebel ship and discovering they're helpless is unintentional harm. All in all, the game seems to suggest that the only moral option is to do nothing at all. Or does it? What makes FTL fascinating from an ethical standpoint is its apparent lack of a way to measure morality. Take Mass Effect 2, often cited as having one of the best morality systems in video games. Your actions influence Paragon and Renegade scores, effectively a point system for being a good or bad person, and those decisions shape who your character is. Compare with, say, Grand Theft Auto, where committing crimes gives you a wanted level. These games, and many others, codify actions as morally good or morally bad by giving them direct mechanical implications. Even a few FTL mods try something similar. Remember that scrapped crew morale system from early in FTL's development? Captain's Edition, one of the largest and best-known mods, brings it back. If you perform enough actions the game deems unethical, your crew members revolt. The mod is in effect telling you what's right and wrong. But as we've already seen from the dev's statements, vanilla FTL doesn't do anything of the sort. In a way, this is more accurate to reality. We don't have a big good boy score hanging over our head at all times. Yet, and that's the reason ethics as a field exists. Remember, we don't have any consensus on the right answers. Nor do we ever get a second chance if we get something wrong. FTL mirrors even this through its permadeath system. If you make a bad ethical choice in Mass Effect, you can go back to the last save and try again. In FTL, you can't. You have to live with your decisions in a given run, and that knowledge weighs heavier when making them. But much as FTL insists it's an unbiased observer of your decisions, it can't help but impose a shadow of a morality measure, and hence an ethical framework. What was it I compared the Rebels supplying civilians event to again? You're flying a bomber plane in a just war. Just war. Just war. How does FTL justify its war? There's a telling line in the text prompt as you enter the final sector. On receiving your vital intel about the Rebel flagship, an NG General states, "Risk all or save none." In the world of FTL, everything you do is in service of defeating the Rebel flagship. If you don't, the Rebellion wins the war and takes control of the galaxy. The Rebellion is an intensely xenophobic human supremacist movement, which is quite funny when FTL's humans are common and uninteresting. Maybe they have a self-esteem problem. It's implied that Rebellion victory would lead to widespread death and suffering, especially for non-human species. Everything must be done to defeat them, because nothing left on the table will matter afterwards. Risk all or save none. If my overview of normative ethics was at all effective, you'll instantly recognise this as a utilitarian argument. No matter how much pain you inflict on your quest, it pales in comparison to the untold suffering a Rebellion victory would bring. Anything that makes you more likely to defeat the Rebel flagship is therefore the most ethical option. Take all the slaves you can get, steal the civilian supplies, and yes, do not accept surrender, because each one serves the true goal of beating the flagship. And while you're at it, bomb both the munitions factory and the school for good measure. Despite the developers' desire for open morality, the one complete narrative thread they include still imposes moral imperatives. Because, for better or worse, FTL is a game, and you win the game by defeating the flagship. And yes, there's substantial debate over whether that's even the right thing to do. I mean, the Federation isn't squeaky clean, but the game's narrative structure tells you that's the ultimate good. If you try an alternative ethical code, you can get by for a while, but in true consequentialist fashion, the game will soon confront you with the folly of your past actions as the outcome is you being blown to smithereens and the rest of the galaxy with you. Do it. Try being an alternatively good person in FTL who can still beat the flagship. I dare you. YouTuber NerdCube tried it. He played it as Jesus, adopting a deontological approach with rules to never instigate violence and always accept surrender, plus some virtue ethics about being generous and modest. It didn't go well for him.
Well, now my ship's exploded, you see. So... yes.
And if you needed yet more evidence, I found this empirical study into the normative principles people use when confronting the trolley problem. One interesting finding. Utilitarianism and psychopathy had a significant positive correlation. What does FTL believe? It believes in pulling the lever. In the opening scene of Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, several Starfleet cadets take part in a training simulation that's gathered a fair bit of infamy over the years. I mean, even I have strong associations with it, and I've only ever seen the J.J. Abrams movies. Yeah, rip my nerd cred. The Kobayashi Maru is a test of a star captain's character. The simulated bridge receives a distress call from a ship stranded in the neutral zone, an area of space Federation starships are forbidden from entering. Doing so would violate a treaty with the Klingons. The choice is simple: leave the stranded crew to die, or save them and risk inciting a war. Bringing normative ethics to bear against this scenario, we see the utilitarian would steer clear. A few lives sacrificed to avoid war, a small price to pay. A deontologist, though, might charge in to save the crew regardless if they believed they should always provide aid when requested, which is in fact Starfleet policy. The Kobayashi Maru is designed to test the captain's reaction to a no-win scenario, to both tease out their normative leanings and assess their resolve when the chips are down. A test of leadership and ethical decision-making. A major part of Star Trek's appeal, and a major part of old fans' disdain for the new movies, is the franchise's preference for thought over action. Characters grapple with difficult decisions, and the most revered figures are those who epitomise logical and moral leadership. Since the FTL devs took particular inspiration from Star Trek, it's easy to see how this grew into FTL's morality system. The Captain Kirk experience isn't being the best space warrior, but the best space leader, making hard, impactful decisions for everyone with no way back. That's why FTL puts so much emphasis on ethical decision-making, with the examples I outlined and many more. However, there is a bit of an elephant in the room here, isn't there? According to Steam, I have over 300 hours logged in FTL. Surely then I must be some kind of ethical superhero who stops and considers every dilemma with supreme depth and wisdom. Well... The great tragedy of FTL is that it's not a treatise on ethical decision-making in space. It's a video game. After enough playtime, players stop engaging with the decisions they make on a narrative level. They learn the events, they learn the odds and the rewards, and suddenly they aren't making moral choices, but mathematical ones. The aim of the game, defeating the flagship, may have some moral substance, but in practical terms it boils down to one thing: get the most stuff at all costs. Few actually care about the fate of the galaxy after several playthroughs. They only care about what they'll receive from each encounter, how much they can maximise that profit and the probabilities of it all, tossing aside all ethical considerations that might get in the way of their eternal slot machine. Most of the time I barely notice Joubert's painstakingly written text content, my eyes darting straight to the scrap reward. At one point the devs even patched the game to make that reward easier to read at a glance. Other trappings of the game's design further pave over its ethical questions. The art style is simple, for instance. While you certainly can empathise with these sprites as Justin Marr's brother did, it's a lot easier to switch that part of your brain off after a while. Then there's the music. In the words of one journalist, it goes blip and bloop and dinging-ing with reverberating voices, rapping hazy nebulae and fierce space battles with warm melodies that sing, "Oh my god, we're in space!" With the main theme in particular, Prunty wanted to evoke the feeling of a nice, breezy cruise through space. Most of the soundtrack conjures ideas of either serenity or action, and with all of the dinging-inging chiptune synths around, the end result is often quite bright and funky. That's kind of at odds with the grim underbelly of the FTL universe when you think about it. It could be argued that the game trivialises its distressing questions by painting over everything with a light-hearted, retro gamified tone. That's not the argument I'm making, but it could be argued. Not that that's even a criticism. FTL's design choices are undeniably superb, and the devs certainly didn't set out to de-emphasize ethical quandaries. It's simply interesting to consider the unintended consequences of things like this. Even when you're not consciously imposing a tone or conveying a position, the fact that a human made something means it will carry that anyway. In Tom Joubert's post on slavery in FTL, he has this to say. It would be irresponsible of anyone to put out a game like this without thinking at least a little about the stance they are necessarily taking by making a game at all. Subjects like slavery and war are not simply there for our amusement. When we deploy them in interactive fiction, we also need to design the choices and outcomes in a way that doesn't undermine the seriousness, but instead uses it to express something worthwhile. While FTL's message of moral choice may suffer slightly from being in a video game, it's very, very far from the most extreme examples. Many games hardly give morality a second glance, framing something ethically abhorrent as merely a new high score. Again, not a condemnation. These games are amazing at what they do. Simply a reminder to think about Joubert's words from time to time and be aware of how a game's design can warp its moral stance. Because no matter how hard it might try, a game can't be reality. Its ethical dilemmas will never match those we grapple with in real life, as they are always beholden to the rest of the game. But maybe that should give us hope. Remember the Kobayashi Maru? It may be a no-win scenario, but isn't it simulated decision-making also a kind of video game? Captain Kirk found a way to win. He reprogrammed it. He stopped playing the game. Debate about whether this was cheating or not rages on to this day, but it does shine a light on how silly simulated ethics can be. Yes, trolley problems do exist in the real world, but you're rarely bound to only two options. I mean, the real world is messy and uncertain, not the neat deterministic place ethical dilemmas and games about ethics would like you to believe. A game is a box. You can think outside of it. Yes, eventually you might stop reading FTL's text and focus solely on extracting profit, but that's because, unlike reality, the game has clearly defined rules and procedures. It even maybe came to a decision on its normative ethical stance. Real humans still can't figure that one out. And despite pesky limitations such as these which come from being a video game, FTL still manages to teach us that ethics is complex and difficult, even with all these different theories to play with, and that we need to be aware of that both in our games and in our lives. And for a thing two guys, with a bit of help, built in their apartments in a year just to see whether they could, I call that pretty damn impressive. You know, it's a good thing that reality is not a box that can be optimized as much as FTL, because if you've seen a computer do an FTL speedrun, it's absolutely mental. Total and utter efficiency in destruction with nary a care for being ethical. FTL was a mistake. This video was a mistake. But I still need to make something, or my subscribers will be livid at me for making them wait so long for nothing. Okay. New video ideas. Okay. I've got one. Got one. Hey, so does anyone remember Into the Breach? In Subset Games' highly anticipated follow-up to FTL, you make humanity's final stand in the face of destruction, sending a team of battle mechs back in time to change the course of history by pushing giant bugs around on a chess-like grid. Wait a minute. Chess? Back in time? Oh. Oh no. Phew, that took a lot of work, that one. Very sorry for being so late with it, but this video was a journey of discovery for me, and that journey had a lot of meanders. Thank you very much for watching, whatever this ended up being at any rate. Also, special thanks to MantisManMike for providing his event testing mods, so I didn't have to play the game for 3 days straight to record all the events I needed. As for what's next, I have a few ideas and things in the works, but I won't make any commitments this time. Well, except the 10,000 subscriber Q&A, that's definitely coming very soon. Otherwise though, I suppose it's all a big surprise. And with that, I hope you enjoyed this, and I shall see you all next time. Goodbye.